All right, I'm assuming most everybody's here by now. Looks like we're right on schedule. I am currently in Texas, so I'm obviously an hour behind you guys in the sense, so it's 7 o'clock here, which for me, that's a great thing. I love early morning classes. So anyway, today what we're going to get started with, Chris Murphy, one of our graduates from the MSRED program from several years ago, has agreed to come in and talk a little bit about kind of his involvement with investing in real estate over the past several years, and also aspects of property management. So with that, I know that Chris is going to kind of go over his own background, so I will turn it over to him. And it sounds like there's a train coming in my background here. So anyway, turning it over to Chris.
Good morning, everybody. So this is my first time presenting on Zoom. So just as a quick story to start us off, I used to, I think, give this lecture for about 10 years or some version of it. When I first gave it, I bought my first property the same month my son was born, and that was about 10 years ago. And now he was the one today who helped me set up the Zoom PowerPoint presentation and taught me how to do it. So it all seems to come full circle pretty quickly. We're going to talk today about investing in real estate. I like this quote about entrepreneurship because I think that as students of the program, when you graduate, you can have two choices. You can find a job working in real estate, or you can find a job working in real estate while also at the same time start investing in your own properties. This will be kind of a guidebook of play-by-play of just how to start doing that. My most recent role, so just a little bit about my background. Most recent role was I was at Equity One. I had taken acquired by Regency Centers about 3 years ago. So I was with Equity One for about 8 years, and then transferred over to Regency Centers when they acquired. I used to manage big Publix anchored shopping centers, Home Depot anchored shopping centers, and things of that type of thing. So fairly concentrated in data, etc. I negotiated a couple $100,000 square feet with new leases, about $50 million worth of redevelopment, construction, and tenant build-outs from everybody from Starbucks to Publix to mom and pops. I have an MBA in real estate with the CPM designation and CCIM designation. But I'm also on the board of directors of the Community Redevelopment Agency of Northwest Fort Lauderdale. And we'll get more into this a little bit later, but the CRA approves the provides funding for deals. If you know Northwest deal or funding for the deal in some way, then you come and present to the CRA. We want to know how many jobs you're creating, what's it going to look like, what you're going to do for the community. The CRA awards get anywhere from $4,000 or $5,000 for a small home renovation, up to $5 million for larger deals. Some other deals that have come through have been in 450 housing units, $50, $60, $70 million deals. So that's what I'm currently involved with. But in addition to this, when I started at Equity One, I also acquired my first property. So this is my other background that I was running simultaneous to my work at Equity One. So I currently have a portfolio of properties, primarily small apartment buildings and single-family houses in Northwest Fort Lauderdale. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sistrunk corridor, and please feel free at any point during this presentation to speak up or ask a question or whatever you need. The Sistrunk corridor is between Broward and Sunrise Boulevard, east of 95, and it's an overlooked part of Fort Lauderdale. I've seen a lot of development, a lot of growth over the past 10 years. I've acquired 58 houses and apartments in the area. I still own the large majority of them, and I handle all site selection, acquisition, legal financing, etc. So this is kind of a step-by-step guide today of how that was possible, how it can be duplicated, how it can be still done well, how it can be done while still maintaining your day job. This is shows the proximity of the sites that I own to some of the development projects. So the colored squares are all the projects taking place in downtown Fort Lauderdale. These are big, 10 million plus developments. And then the blue dots are some of my sites that are near, just to show the proximity to downtown and the neighborhood that we're talking about. Brief overview, we're going to talk about how to get started, just some of the initial steps. We're going to talk about developing your concept and then developing a network that you guys are already working with. We're going to stay focused on building a track record and talk about how that gets done. And then we'll walk through deal examples. These are a couple of older deal examples that I've done, but they're still relevant because they talk about creating value, about how to utilize seller financing, and then how to handle larger deals and come up with the cash for those deals. So one of the questions I get sometimes is, would you have anything more current, because some of these go back a few years. So I do also include 2 recent deals that I've done in 2020, just to show you how those came about, the returns, all that type of things, so some real recent ones. And then we'll talk about funding sources, real capital sources for beginning investors who may not have a ton of money to start with, may not have a lot of contacts to start with. So it's really just about getting scrappy and working with what you have. Any questions so far? All right.
Do you own the Swiss truck marketplace with all the different restaurants?
I don't, but the CRA approved money for that deal. So CRA gave $a few million for that deal, and then the gentleman who owns it bought the building also behind it recently. It's going to be doubling the size of the market, so we gave him some money for that additional acquisition as well.
Yeah, I saw that the other day when we went to the place. It's a pretty good place to eat for lunch.
Yeah, there's a lot more coming along the corridor that's under construction, but yeah, that's a nice place, absolutely. I like this quote because it essentially means that you have nothing to lose by getting started. So we'll talk through some of the initial steps, kind of the basics of building your real estate empire. We'll just briefly go through this, but this is kind of just a play-by-play of what you'll want to do to begin with. To get incorporated, you can go to Sunbiz, and this is where you'll register and sign up for your LLC. It's a less than 10-minute process. It's less than $150. And you can research at Sunbiz what LLCs are already in existence, what names aren't taken, and then the state will send you a piece of paper within 2 to 3 days confirming that you have registered your LLC and they've accepted it. So it's pretty quick, it's easy, it's cheap, and you can do it now. After you do that, you can go online to the IRS website and request your tax ID number. The tax ID number is like your social security number, but for businesses. So it's needed to open bank accounts, for taxes, and for any partnership agreements you're going to do. Many of you probably already have experience with building websites. Mine is still quite basic, but this is just another step early on that you can take today. So what you're trying to build starts to become real. You can begin learning about different markets and looking at different properties within these markets to create projections. And we'll talk more about this in developing your concept. But I think one of the keys is really to start small, take some baby steps. All right, so developing your concept. One of the takeaways here is that you should really start off somewhere where you have the most experience doing what you most enjoy. So for me, when I first moved down to South Florida after college, I was in Liberty City and I managed Northside Shopping Center, which, if any of you are familiar with it, is a 700,000 square foot property on more than 50 acres, right in the middle, probably one of the roughest neighborhoods in South Florida. But I absolutely loved it. We invested a lot of money, we redeveloped it, we had maybe 95 tenants there, everybody from your neighborhood flea market tenants to your Citibank and your big supermarkets and so forth. But that was what I enjoyed. So I was able to take some of that experience and put it into the work that I'm now doing on Sistrunk. Finding an easy access point, where can you get into your niche, what you like best for the lowest amount of initial investment. If you want to focus on warehouses, what's the cheapest and easiest way to get into a warehouse? If it's apartments, if it's luxury high-rise, whatever it is, how can you get in? So what I've done in the past is I typically look for foreclosures, and there aren't as many of those around these days, but you can still find overlooked properties with physical defects, structural, geographic defects, things that you can work to overcome to add value to the site, and maybe find sites that other people haven't found to get your start. But I think you want something that, at a minimum, can be replicated or grown to build your track record. You know, bread and butter deals that cash flow enough to help you acquire that second property and third property, not a one and done type of deal where you put all your money into it and then you're sitting with this property for a long time. You know, you may be able to hold the property for a long time, but you want to have the cash flow so you can keep turning it into other deals. I think some of the common misconceptions that you need a lot of money to start investing, or that you have to find the perfect home run deal and that you can do it alone. I think that having the network is a tremendous help, and I think not every deal has to be a home run. I think I've had the most success with, you know, singles and doubles that turned into, you know, triples or home runs later on. I think those bread and butter deals really wind up being key. Your network. So the program that you guys are taking now will provide you with all of the information, all the resources you need to learn about the industry, you know, the specifics, the deal flow, the cash sheets, you know, all of it. But beyond that, it also pairs you with other students, like-minded individuals. So pair you with a mentor. You'll have a network of industry peers and potential investors, and you'll also have a network of potential deal partners. You know, the tools that you have in front of you, you can start, you know, pairing up with classmates now with similar interests to you to begin looking at deals, begin calling banks together if you have a deal in the works, and just begin creating simple pro formas as well. There was a deal that I looked at 6 months ago, and I called up the bank. I said, hey, this is the deal I'm looking at. What would the terms be like today? And, you know, I called up the bank just last week because they know the terms are different. But you can do that with what you have now. If you're looking at a deal, warehouse deal, you want to call up the banker who's been through the program and say, hey, what would it cost to finance this deal? How much would I need to put down? And begin learning about those things with your network. That'll be a tremendous leg up when you get out of the program. On a personal note, I mean, I've gotten a lot of help from people who've been through the program and people who are affiliated with the program. My mentor of 9 years was Terry Stiles. We get together every month for breakfast. We go over his house at Christmas for the boat parade. And he spent a lot of time with me just looking at individual deals that I was working on and, you know, guiding it and helping it along. And I think the biggest, you know, help in working with him was that every month when we get together for breakfast, I had to have something new to talk about with him. I couldn't show up and just have nothing for him. So it created tremendous pressure for me to always have that next deal in the works, the next deal to buy. And when I started buying properties, you know, now in hindsight, if you look back and say, oh man, that was a great time to start buying 10 years ago. At the time, it seemed like the dumbest thing in the world. Everybody was saying, hey, the housing market's never going to come back in South Florida. You must be out of your mind. You're buying in these neighborhoods. What are you doing? And he was the one who I'd go to, and I'd say, listen, I just bought this deal. It makes a lot of sense on paper. The cash flow's great. It's working. I must be missing something. What am I missing? He'd be the one to say, just keep going. You're on the right track. Keep going. And I'd do the same thing the month after that. I had picked up this other deal. I must be missing something. Everybody thinks I'm crazy. And he was the one who'd say, just keep going. You're on the right track. And all these people, you know, if you need a mortgage broker, if you need large deal investor, if you need mentors, I mean, all these people are still affiliated with the program that I work with on a day-to-day basis. Your track record. So when you approach banks and investors, they will ask you about your track record. This is your story, your elevator pitch of sorts. So it can be, you know, expanded responsibilities within your day-to-day role. It can be small initial investments of increasingly complex size and complexity. It can be working closely with your mentor to solve problems that they might have that they're either vocal about or that you know they have from talking with them, but they may not, you know, directly come to you to solve. But you propose a solution and work your way up. As you're building your track record, it really needs to be three things. It needs to be easily explainable and understandable, something that can be tangible and demonstrated. And you can't see my hands right now, but something that you can, you know, come up with, you know, a pitch book. These are pictures of projects I've done. These are examples of leases that I've done. You know, this lease was for 2,000 square feet. Here's another one I did for 4,000, 6,000, and so forth. But something that you can demonstrate, something that is built gradually over time, and you can show easily to an investor or bank or somebody, hey, this is how I've built my track record and grown it. We're going to talk through some case studies. I love this quote because I think a lot of times when I speak to students, the response I get is, once I get out of the program, then I'll start investing, or, once I have a baby, I'll start investing, or once I get married, or settle this or that, or another thing. But I think there's no reason why you can't start right away. And I like this because when it came time for me to leave Regency Centers and Equity One, I was very happy that I acquired the properties 10 years before. And the first property I bought, I mentioned earlier, was the same month my first son was born. It was 3 months into my job at Equity One. We just bought a new, more expensive townhouse, my wife and I. So it was probably, and I had no cash, so it was probably the worst possible time to begin investing. So there's no reason why any of you can't start right away as well. So we're going to walk through some case studies. You've now formed your LLC, you've developed your concept, you've built your network, and you started to form your track record. So how you buy your properties. This is a good example of creating value. And I think that if there's nothing else you take away from the class today, I want you to take away that real estate, if nothing else, is about creating value. At the end of the day, it's about creating physical value, so you create financial value for yourself. When you're looking at properties, you should be looking at them in a way in which you want to create value and see an opportunity to create value. I mean, this is one of the first properties I purchased, and it's not sexy or glamorous, but there's the potential to create value. This was a duplex in Hollywood, 61,000. It had a number of challenges. It been at the market for a long time. It had almost 700,000 city liens. It was boarded up. Vagrants were living at the property. But it had a lot of potential to create value. So it was in a good neighborhood for what I was trying to do with it. It had a solid structure, concrete block, concrete floors, the roof was in good shape, and the units were relatively large. And at that time, the potential rent per side was $850 per side. I kept this in here with the financials from when these deals were done. Now I'm getting $1250 per side on that same rental. So substantially more, but I wanted to keep it relevant to this time. There's some beautiful pictures of this sexy deal. And to this day, this is probably one of the roughest physical conditions of a property that I've worked on. And there were people, homeless people living in here at the time of acquisition. So creating physical value. So first thing I did is when you go into contract on a property, you'll have a certain period of inspection. So if it's a larger property, maybe it's 30 or 45 days. If it's a smaller property, maybe it's a week or 2 weeks. During the inspection period, you can get all of your surveys done. You can do all your investigations, your reports, your structural analysis, all of it. And you can still back out of the deal without losing your deposit if you find something you don't like. So when I went under contract with this property during that due diligence period, I sat down and met with the city, and I brought the city my track record. I showed them, I think this was maybe the third or fourth deal I'd done, maybe fourth or fifth, but I went to them and I showed them, hey, here's another similar property I'd acquired previously. This is what I was able to do with it. This is how I was able to make it better, create value for the city and for myself. I can do the same thing with this property, but I can't do it with this property with $700,000 worth of liens. Nobody can. So I need you to work with me to get these liens down so I can acquire this property and do what I need to do. This property's been sitting here for a long period of time. It's going to continue to sit here otherwise. It was next to a church, and it was down the street from a school at the time. I let them know there were vagrants living in the property. You don't want to have kids walking to school past a house with no electricity, abandoned, and people living in there. So this created a real hazard for the city. They negotiated down and provided me with a letter saying they would settle these violations for $3,600 as long as I completed my renovations at the property within 90 days from the time I acquired it. So I had this letter in hand during my inspection period. In case the city wouldn't play ball, then I could still cancel my deal and not lose out on my deposit. Thankfully, they did agree to work with me. So I had that letter from them. I closed on the deal, evicted the vagrants, fumigated the property, invested $18,000 to renovate the units inside and outside. So this is a good example of creating physical value to create the financial value. These are some of the metrics of how it worked out. This was a property, at that time, you had to wait a year when you acquired something before you could refinance it. So with this property, after 1 year, the property was reappraised, and the bank was able to lend on the new value. So the new value was based on what my tenants in there were paying. The units were renovated, all of the physical value that I created. So the total mortgage was $70,000. Because I acquired this property with cash and the renovations cash, that $70,000 mortgage was cashed back out to me, could be used for the next investment. And I've done many deals like this. This is how I, when I started this business, the only capital I had was an initial $15,000 loan from my father-in-law, and I had maybe less than $10,000 or $12,000 of my own to invest. So I put that together to get the first deal, and then from that point through now and all these units, it's just been recycling the same cash over and over and over again. And I'm still doing it today. This property, these days, it's valued closer to $280,000, but it cash flows about, these days a lot more, but at that time, $810 per month, so about 10 grand annually on a net investment of 13,000, because I put in 83,000, I took back out 70,000, so I had like 13,000 left in the deal, and so that was about 74% return on your money. So if you're a big company like Styles, and you're investing in deals, you may invest in a stabilized deal, like if it's a downtown office building or such, that with financing gives you a return in the low to mid-teens. If it's a development deal, maybe you want to see returns in the high teens to low 20s. So if you can see a 74% return on your money, you're doing okay. This is the end product. Any questions about this one so far?
I'm sorry, can you that last sentence on the returns as far as what you would consider a good return for something like this?
So I think I think it really depends. I think it depends on how experienced you are. I think it depends on, a lot of personal characteristics. I think that for me, it's very difficult to see 74% returns all the time. I typically won't invest in something unless I can get returns in the mid to upper 20s. And it doesn't have to be, day one or after 6 months, but I want to invest in something where I know, within a year, within 18 months, where my returns can be, in that range going forward. I think with redevelopment deals in a tough neighborhood, you want to see those type of returns because a lot of things can go wrong. And if you're going into a deal expecting lower returns than that, then you could be setting something for failure.
What about investing in like core markets, like maybe downtown metropolitan areas? What returns do? I mean, is that something that you do, or does you expect at that point? Expect low returns because the demographic at that point, maybe it's you have a different demographic of different tenant base. So is that something you would expect maybe a much lower return would be acceptable?
Sure. So these days, if you look on the MLS or if you look on CoStar, I think most downtown stabilized large deals are advertising returns of maybe 5 to 6.5%. And then if you use financing to acquire, maybe you can get that financing at 3% or 3.125% these days. And so those returns go up to maybe 8%. High 7s, low 8s on stabilized cash flowing downtown deals. So I think to get a return above that, you really got to do some work and get into it.
But I'm saying what you're saying is you much rather deal in well, this is I guess your personal preference. You much rather deal in a bit further away from core markets. To get
correct. This is my niche. This is what I have experience with, and this is what I'm good at. Yeah, absolutely. And I think for everybody, it's going to be different. You probably see different returns if you invested in high rises on Brickell, right, or warehouses in Oakland Park, right. So it varies. It just really depends on what you're looking for. Alright, so the next one is utilizing seller financing. This was an interesting deal because this was a 5-unit building located in Fort Lauderdale for $150,000. It was in pretty rough shape. It had been in the market for a long time. It had a cloud on the title, so if you have a cloud on the title, it means that there's something wrong with the property that the banks won't finance. So in this case, it was a roof overhang onto an adjacent property, which is easy enough to correct, but this is something you really want to dive into during your due diligence period, because the bank won't finance, no bank will finance a deal if you've got part of the property hanging onto somebody else's property. Only 1 unit was rented. Tough neighborhood. Banks wouldn't have touched this deal, one, because of the cloud on the title, but also because it had no cash flow with only 1 unit rented. And to top it all off, the seller wanted cash only, because of course he did. So when I arrived at the property, I set up a meeting with the seller, and this is how this went down, and this is how we got to the seller financing. So I asked to meet the seller of the property. He was coming up from Aventura. He was a much older gentleman. He wore a suit and tie. He didn't seem like he was suited or comfortable with the neighborhood. He pulled up in a very nice Mercedes or such and got out, and you could tell he was looking over his shoulder. I think he was worried he was going to be robbed. But you could tell he wasn't visiting the site. He wasn't collecting rent. This property for him was a problem that he wanted to get rid of. He didn't know the tenant's name, didn't know the names of her children, nothing, had nothing to the property. So I started talking with him, and I highlighted for him all the challenges of financing this property, and the property had sat there for a long time. So I proposed to him that if he could finance part of this deal for me for just 1 year, then I could get him this full asking price after that year, and he could go on his way, and he wouldn't have to worry about this property ever again. And I offered to take up the management of the property during the due diligence contract period. So if he agreed to the deal, then the next day, he wouldn't have to think about this property ever again. And you could see his face light up like a child at Christmas. So this property had a lot of potential. It had a low per unit price, 30 grand per unit. Units were in decent condition, a lot better than the duplex in Hollywood. That one tenant who was there was kind of watching the property. She was known in the neighborhood, so people weren't messing with the property and tearing it apart in the meantime. And it had great potential if I could get all 5 units rented out, some strong rents in the future. Here's a couple of key photos. The lime room actually is painted the ceiling lime, as well as all the walls. And the floor was a shade of lime as well. And they had tinfoil in the windows, so I think this was the smoke weed room in this apartment. This is how the seller financing actually worked. So we talked about the banks wouldn't finance it. It wasn't cash flowing, poor condition, and the title defect, but there's an opportunity there. The seller agreed to finance $100,000 of the $150,000 sales price at 6% for a period of 1 year. Now, I mentioned earlier that I have my real estate license, and I'd encourage everybody in this class to get the real estate license as soon as you can. It's less than $500. It takes a week to complete. You take a state test, and you've got it. You can hang it up with a broker. And the deal that I made with my broker is the same deal you make with your brokers, is that for any third-party deals I do, he gets a percentage of the deal. This is typical. Or for any deals I do for myself, I keep 100% of it. So if I'm buying a house for my wife and I to live in, and the seller's paying a commission, then I get to pocket that and put it towards the down payment on my house. In this case, it worked exactly the same way. So the seller on this deal paid me a 3% commission as the agent for myself. So I got a $4,500 commission on this deal, which I paid to him at closing as part of that 6% interest for the first year. So he basically paid $4,500 of his own interest for the first year. So the first year of the property, hold this for a year while I did my work, cost me basically nothing. During that time, the property was renovated, leased up, and the title defect was cured. At the end of 1 year and 1 day, very similar to the Hollywood duplex, I was able to get a mortgage on the new appraised value. The total mortgage was for $130,000, so I had $100,000 to pay off the seller, and $30,000 cash back to me, $50,000 I put down. So now I'm left with only $20,000 in this property. Total rents got up to about $4,200 a month. which is a great 250% return. I ended up selling the property after 18 months for $270,000. Today the property would be worth a lot more, but I've been able to do a lot of damage with that cash in the meantime. This is the final product. Does anybody have any questions about how this deal is structured?
I have like curiosity with the specific type of markets that you're going for, and did you have like a lot of concern with I mean, obviously you must have had some type of concern with your vacancy rates and such. Did you account for that just in your initial financing, or how did you kind of like go about the additional risk with the area that you're playing in?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. You know, despite the area being a little bit tougher, my vacancy rates are not higher than anybody else's. I've been close to 100% occupied for the past at least 5-6 years. At this time, the market was a little bit softer. So what I try to do is when I renovate the insides of my units, you'll see some photos later on, but I really try to create a premium product on the interior, especially with the renovations we've done the past 4 or 5 years. That way I have the nicest product in the worst neighborhoods. So typically I'm always filled up. Whenever you do acquire something, you want to account for, you know, some downtime, especially if you're going to be renovating it. So for this property, it really did take me all of about 6 to 9 months before I got it really renovated, fully leased up. So I really did need that whole year to get everything in order. So yeah, there's always going to be some vacancy, and you definitely want to account for some turnover in your financial projections.
Did it take a little bit longer to absorb the product initially?
You know, sometimes in this neighborhood with these properties, you know, certain properties might have a stigma around them.
Right.
So this was a property that had been vacant for a while, was in tough shape, and everybody in the neighborhood knew that. So it took a little bit of time for people to see and know what I was doing there, and to be able to show people the units and get them to trust enough to come at least look at the inside of the product before it turned around.
And just my final question here to wrap it up, were your tenants that you're kind of aiming for, were they typically low income or subsidized housing?
So I do have some Section 8 tenants. And Section 8 is a program where, you know, the person has a voucher for Section 8. If you're the landlord, they can go to any landlord and say, hey, here's my voucher. And, you know, if the rental is $1,200 a month, Section 8 may pay any portion of that. They could pay 100% or they could pay 80%, and then the tenant's responsible for paying the rest. And it's, you know, some landlords go for Section 8 exclusively. The nice part of it is that on the first of every month, the federal government deposits that check right into your bank account. You don't have to think about it. I don't love Section 8 as much. I mean, I won't exclude people who have Section 8 vouchers, and I have in my portfolio 5 or 6 tenants who have Section 8 vouchers. But I've had all kinds of experiences with the tenants. Some have been wonderful tenants, some have been a nightmare, and some tenants pay their portion and some don't pay their portion. So even though housing pays the first chunk for them, the hardest part of collections is not that first chunk, it's always that second piece. So I had a woman who Section 8 paid, you know, $1,300 of her rent, and her portion is like $65. And she could never come up with that $65. Like, it was just enough where I couldn't let it go and not let her not pay it. But it was too much for her to come, like, and it was just the biggest headache I've ever had for $65 a month. And these days, Section 8 is more difficult because with all the issues with COVID, you know, it can take 3-4 months before you get that first Section 8 check from them. So if you sign a lease in July, Section 8 will pay you, you know, July is around August, September, October, but you may not get that first check from them until October, and then they'll pay you every month after that, and they'll, you know, make up for that period of time, but you're fronting, you know, for several months, and you know, it's a pain. You don't want to deal with that when you have other tenants who are willing to pay.
And I always ask too, I guess kind of the stigma from what I feel with sponsorship development is that typically developers really try not to manage their properties initially? I guess, I mean, it depends obviously on the deal structure, of course. Do you find yourself managing these smaller deals yourself? And kind of, I mean, a lot of it is, like you were saying, your little strategy with having your own license and being able to do some of the sales due diligence yourself. Do you also manage the properties yourself as well?
I do. You know, when I was at Equity One at Regency, I managed large portfolios, hundreds of tenants. So managing these myself, you know, came naturally. And I think that if it's an area that you're specialized in, that you really like, and you feel like you're well suited for, then there's really nobody else better to manage your product for you. You know, typically in this neighborhood, if I were to hire a third-party management company, I'd be paying 8 to 10% a month the total gross revenue as management fees, and that's a lot of money coming off the top of your profits. And you know, you want to be, you know, at the face of the tenant. You want to see what's going on. You want to be able to handle things yourself. Even, you know, when tenants leave and you have to turn over, you have to be able to do it quickly. You know, it's money in your pocket, and if you have a third-party management company doing it, they're not going to be as invested as you are. Any other questions about the seller financing?
You typically put 1 to 3% down, or well, I guess you're putting the full probably like 20 or 30% down, right? You're not. Are you bringing other investors on board, or are these strictly your deals?
Yeah, these are all just my deals. You know, when I was at Equity One, we had a number of JV partners, so I have experience working with joint venture partners, and I prefer to do it on my own. I like being able to make decisions, be accountable to nobody else, to be able to, you know, react fast when I need to, and not try to seek approval from partners. And as you do, you know, larger deals, you're going to have to work with partners, unless you want to front all the cash yourself. But if you can, when you're starting out with getting deals, do as much of it as you can yourself and maintain control of the deals, I think you'll be in a better place. You know, some of the strategies we're going to talk later for financing, you know, operate with that in mind. And for this deal, you know, this is a perfect case study. I could have come up with that $100,000 that he financed from, you know, 2 or 3 investors, and then those 2 or 3 investors at the end of the day would have got, you know, 2/3 of my profits on this deal. But if I get the seller finance, I get to keep 100% myself.
No, that's great. Don't let me hold you up anymore.
No, that's great. Keep asking. K33, this was a larger purchase, and for this purchase, I was able to get cash for this deal from several different places. So this was a large deal, probably about, this took place about 3 years ago. So this was 4 separate single-family homes in Fort Lauderdale. They were in decent shape. Total for all 4 was $480,000. So I needed, this was traditional bank financing with a traditional lender. This was First National Bank of South Miami. And so I needed to put 30% down. You know, these days for larger deals, you can get away with 20% down. But for, you know, something like this, they'd probably still want 30%. I needed to hold on to as much cash as possible for the next deal, so I don't want to put up any more money into this than I needed to. The 4 properties are part of a larger 65-unit package, had to be separated out. So this is a good example of finding properties that maybe somebody else would have overlooked. So this seller was trying to sell all 65 units they owned. It was some houses and some apartments, but they weren't having any bites on the whole package because certain portions of it were tremendously overpriced. So it brought the price of the whole package way up beyond what people wanted to look at. So it had sat for a little while. I looked at it when it was a whole 65-unit deal, and I saw that, and I saw that it was still out there about 2 months later. So I called up the agent. I let her know, hey, you know, you have 4 houses in this deal that kind of don't fit with everything else. You know, the rest is kind of apartments, you know, 8-unit apartments, 10-unit apartment buildings. Then you have these 4 houses that are kind of stragglers. Let me take these 4 houses off of you, and then you can sell the rest of the package. It'll be more uniform, it'll be more appealing to other buyers. So it took a while to get a response from her. It was just, you know, how she operates. She was hard to get in touch with. That's probably another reason why this sat out there for a little while. But when I did get in touch with her, she agreed to do it. I realized there was a lot of potential here. I was able to use the existing value. The units were all rented out, occupancy was stable. I'd already had a track record, so I was able to show her, you know, why I wanted these properties, how they fit with my portfolio, and I was able to show my track record to the bank to convince them I knew how to operate in this market. I was a good risk for them to take. And because this was 4 houses all at once, the bulk purchase got me lower insurance costs per unit. So that was a tremendous advantage as well. This is how it breaks down. So this is kind of the meat of it. And this is a good example of how it can take a lot less money than you think to acquire a portfolio of properties if you can structure a deal similar to this one. Then you can use your cash for other purposes. And I actually had another deal that closed within 2 weeks of this one for another 3 houses from a different seller. As another side point, this seller with their large package of 60 plus units, I've gone back to that well multiple times. So I picked off the 4 houses. About 9 months later, I picked off an 8-unit apartment building from them. I picked off a duplex from them. So you can keep, you know, if these are people, and every time the price gets better because this continues to sit out there. So she doesn't pick up the phone. So bulk purchase, $480,000. Bank finance a portion. I had to come up with $144,000. So I was able to get a private loan from somebody who was affiliated with the NOVA program for $80,000 at 8%. Now, typically, if you bring in a partner on a deal, they're going to come up with cash and expect a preferred return, maybe 6, 7, 8% preferred return, and at the end of the deal, they're going to want to share the profits. Right? So I structured this not as a partnership. This was just a straight $80,000 loan at 8% per year. I got cash back from the seller at closing, so I told you these properties were in pretty good shape, but I still went through during my due diligence period and picked out every possible thing that I could that was wrong with the properties. Went back to the seller during due diligence and said, listen, I love these properties, I want to close this deal, but there's a number of things that need to be fixed. I don't want to waste your time and you fixing them now. I'll fix them after we close. Just give me back some cash at closing for this deal. So the cash back at closing was to be used to make things better at the properties, but because it took place at the closing table, I was able to use it as part of my down payment. Make sense? And then I also got a commission from the seller at closing on this deal of 3%, so another $14,000. And the interesting thing with this seller is all the subsequent deals that I've done with this same seller, even though now I know them, they know me, I still get 3% on each one of these deals. So through those 3 methods, the total cash I had available to me towards the down payment was $104,000. So the total cash out of pocket was only $40,000, right? About 8% of the total purchase price. Total yearly gross income. This was a stabilized deal, so the places were rented. Over the years, I've moved tenants out. I've increased the rents. The cash flow a lot better now. But at the time, $60,000. I had to pay interest on the private loan. I had to pay mortgage, insurance, real estate taxes, and I was left with $23,000 a year, or about a 57% return on my $40,000 that I had in the deal. Any questions on any of that? So this is a nice example of just how you can use money from a lot of different sources to get your down payment down, so you can keep using and recycling the money.
When you first set your eyes on these 4 houses, did you have all these the 4 different sources of money, or 5 different sources of money already figured out, written out?
So I've used some combination of these on almost all the deals. I typically try to get cash back from the seller at closing. I always include my commissions in the deals. The private loan was the first time I'd worked with this individual, so I knew that I could do it, but him and I hadn't had experience together before this. Yeah, going into this, I think when you think about real estate, you're always thinking about, man, how can I find this next deal? How can I find this next deal? But in reality, half of the bandwidth is always spent on how can I find the cash for the next deal? How can I finance the next deal? The other half of it is the money part. It's about finding the properties, but it's about finding how to pay for the properties. So this is something you'd always be thinking about. So when I go through those three examples, one of the questions I get from folks is, well, those examples are from a couple years ago and prices have gone up since then. How are deals different today, that type of thing. So these are just two, quick recent investments. This was a duplex I picked up in January, right before COVID hit. I went under contract in December. This is actually from the same seller as the four houses. I mentioned that. $150,000. It was in terrible shape inside, but it was, there were tenants in there, so I had to move them out. There were tenants on one side, the other unit was vacant, so I renovated the vacant unit first, and then moved over to her side and did the other side. But made it extremely nice inside, did the outside over, brought in some great tenants. The rent's $1,050 right now. The expenses, are today's expenses. The mortgage, principal and interest is, today's principal and interest. So the net returns on this is 17.5% going in, which isn't a bad place to be. Over the next year to 2 years, this will get up into the the mid-20s that I like to see, because these rents will increase substantially. Right now, these are some of the nicest 1-1s in the neighborhood, and the rents for typical 1-1s going for $11.50 now, and that'll continue to go up. Second recent one, this is one that I picked up in March. Yeah, March. So this closed right as COVID hit. So this has taken a lot longer to renovate and get rented out than I'd anticipated. So this is still very much a work in progress. I've got 3 of the units completely renovated. A 4th is almost done being renovated, and I've got them rented out. This was a $610,000 purchase. You had 10 grand per unit. These are all, current expenses, current rents coming in. I think the rents could be $1,250 to $1,300 for the 2 ones right now, but this property had a certain stigma around it in the neighborhood, so I think those will come up over time as well. But it winds up being a 23% return during COVID, an investment from March. And for these 2 properties, I used a lot of the same strategies. On the prior one, because it was the same seller, I got my 3% commission on the $150,000, the $4,500 towards the down payment. This one I used cash that I recycled from a previous refinance that I completed. And then this was purchased all with cash that I used from prior refinance, and I got a loan on this one for, I think it was 80% of the purchase price. But these are good current examples. What's in the market today? What's doable today? It just depends on what you're looking for. All right, we're going to talk about funding sources. Real estate financing is subjective in some ways because you may see value in a property that others may not see. Investors may not see it. And banks certainly may not see it, especially when you're starting out. So it can be very difficult to finance your first couple of deals. I like this quote because when I was finding lenders at first, it was really just a numbers game. It was calling every lender I could think of to try to get a deal financed. And South Florida Business Journal publishes a list every year of biggest community lenders, the biggest small business lenders. And I would just go down the list and call the first one, cross off the name when they said no, call the second one, they say no, cross off the name, etc. So it's really just about keeping going, and looking for that funding. We're going to talk through, so if you guys have any questions on traditional funding, I can answer those questions for you, but we're going to talk about really finding the capital that you put down into your first deals. Right? So I mentioned that, my first deal was done with a $15,000 loan, and that same money's been recycled over and over again. But finding those small pieces of capital for first deals can be difficult. So this is kind of the approach that I took for some creative ways to do it, and that you might be able to use as well. Please keep in mind I'm not a financial advisor or a tax accountant or an attorney. These are just things that I've used that worked for me. So the first category is the friends and family. This is probably the least formal and most direct. As you're building your track record that we talked about earlier, the people who are around you and who are close to you and who could be good future investment partners for you, you should keep them informed of what you're doing. So when you come to them, your friends and family, and ask for cash, they know, oh, this guy's been building, his track record for the last 3 years, keeps showing me bigger and bigger projects that he or she's been doing. so that it's not a surprise to them, and they have a belief in your capability to do what it is that you're trying to do. And you can go to them with your track record on paper and show them, hey, this is what I've been doing. You know, for the boss I've been working for, I'm ready to do it on my own. I just need the capital. So with friends and family, I think the key is to start early. That's how you do that. Approach it as a standard loan like you would with a bank. Draw out formal documents with an attorney, and make sure you have a plan for repayment. If everything goes wrong with the property, you want to still make sure you have some plan for repayment. You want to get them in on time and have it written up, you know, all the details formally. And what I've found with this is that if you do it right and you do the things you're supposed to do, right, just the basic deliverable, the payments due on the first, you drop it off the day before, you know, just basic things like that. And this is a well that you can go back to time and time again as you refinance deals and you pay them off. You need money for the next deal, they're more than welcome to have you come back and do it again. I had a friend with who inherited a house from a relative that passed away. He had a lot of equity in the house, but he was a plumber at the time and had really no way to invest it. So he was able to take out a mortgage on the house. He lent me the cash, so he was taking out his mortgage at 3%. I was paying him 8% on the money, so he was making money every month, and I was using that money to invest in properties. Right, so it's friends with equity, but same rules apply as family and friends above, right? Have it written out, repayment plan, all that good stuff. I've used 401k, IRA loans, a good source for me of cheap capital in the past. I typically can borrow up to half the amount of your 401k plan. This is relatively cheap money, at 2 or 3% interest, typically a 5 or 6 year payback. And, while the money's borrowed, it won't be growing in your 401k, but you'll be growing it hopefully in real estate. And the benefit for me was that it allowed me to retain full control of my deals. So at a time where you may be tempted to look for outside cash and have to give up a piece of your deal, this was a way for me to string it along just a little bit further and maintain that complete control. These are category 2, which is slightly more formal funding sources. But when I got started out, there was a handful of private lenders operating. There was Discover, the same people as the credit cards. There was peer-to-peer lending sites like Lending Club. Now there's a lot more of this available than ever. And you all probably know a lot of resources that exist today that weren't available back then for deal financing. There's all kinds of syndications available online. There's all kinds of different products. And, interest rates on some of this is cheaper than they used to be. So typically with this category of lenders, this is good for coming up with, I needed 20 grand for a deal or 30 grand for a deal. You'll want to repay it sooner than full term because the money does get expensive because you're paying principal and interest and the time period is short. It's only, 5 or 6 year term. But it's usually fast. You can usually get the cash in, less than 30 days. And then acquisitions commissions, we talked about how I've utilized this for a couple of properties that I've acquired. It's useful if you're buying a larger property too. It's useful just, even if the only property you ever own is your own home, you get a commission on the purchase of your own home, apply it towards your own down payment. You can use these same strategies for your primary residence as you use for your investment properties. But I think finding a broker that you hang your license with that lets you keep 100% of your own deals is something to keep in mind. Please stop me at any point if anybody has any questions on any of these. I know I'm going through them pretty fast. Category 3 is traditional. So, prior acquisitions that you do, this is how you recycle the cash over and over again. So if acquisitions are made in cash, you can typically refinance them for 70% of the purchase price almost immediately. After 12 months, you can refinance based on the new appraised value or the purchase price plus the renovation costs. So you get more of your cash out if you wait a little bit longer. These days, these time periods have shrunk, so you can do a refinance based on the new appraised value with some banks these days in as little as 6 months. So it happens a lot quicker. There's some banks that will do less than that. Most want at least 4 or 5 months of seasoning before they'll do it. And it'll take you time to redevelop a property, get it leased out, do all those things anyways. But this can go a lot faster. We talked about seller financing, usually best for short term, 1 year to 3 years maybe. Slightly higher interest rate, you have an attorney draft the documents, but it's usually fast and efficient. You know, sometimes when you're closing a deal with third-party financing, it can delay the deal. When the seller's providing the financing, there's no delay. They want to see this thing sold. They're not going to hold you up, and it's usually a pretty, you know, quick agreement. It's ideal for sellers what they really want to sell, and gives you an opportunity to ask, you know, what else they own that you can pick up down the road. All right, so in conclusion, we talked about some of the initial steps. We talked about building your network and working with the network that you have. And we talked about how the track record dovetails into all of the other work you're going to do. We talked through creating value. We talked about seller financing and then multiple down payment sources of funding. And then we walked through some of those sources, the peer-to-peer lending, the private lenders, seller financing, and prior acquisitions. That's it. What questions do you have?
Would you say that the 1 to 4 unit range for residential is kind of like your bread and butter, or do you eventually see yourself going more into like commercial residential with larger 5? I know you've done a few that are over 5 units, but larger deals?
I think one of the things I've learned from COVID is that it can be difficult to have. It can be difficult to have a handful of properties spread around the whole neighborhood where you're trying to juggle going back from one to another. So I think, you know, right now I am looking at a couple much larger deals that I would like to get accomplished next year.
I had a question for construction costs. Did you have like a certain percentage range that you always wanted to stay in for your properties, or how did you approach that?
No, I guess I never started out with a range. I think when I'm looking at a deal, I like to be able to figure out, you know, what the worst case scenario is for renovation so that you can factor it into your models correctly. And typically, if you're doing a renovation deal, if it's repairs and small items, you can deduct that against the rent that you're going to get from that property for the first year. So I'd rather buy a $100,000 deal that needed 50 grand worth of work than to buy a $150,000 deal that needed zero work. Because then the first $50,000 worth of rent I'm collecting from those tenants, I'm not paying any taxes on.
What do you usually find is, you know, when you find one of these properties that needs a lot of work, as like the first priorities to fix up, and then other things that maybe not worth touching, you know, putting money into? Yes.
It's a good question. I mean, I think usually the first thing is ripping everything apart. I think, you know, just ripping out all the bad stuff, all the old stuff, and then kind of starting the rebuilding process. But I always try to start at the worst stuff first, right? You start at the building systems, the plumbing, the electric, making sure that's all in good shape before you know, do the floors and the cabinets.
They usually full guts.
Yeah, structure. I think you want to work your way out. Yeah, you don't want to paint the place and then realize you got to rip out all the electric.
I have a different question. You mentioned that you're on the board at CRA in Fort Lauderdale. Does the CRA currently have any subsidies that they're offering to either refurbished properties in the Sistrunk area or do vertical construction?
Yes, they have a lot. So there's a lot to go through. So one of the most recent ones is the CRA owns a bunch of small parcels of land in the neighborhood. So they own, maybe 35 single-family lots in the neighborhood, and they are requesting proposals right now that if you come in and you want to build houses on a portion of these lots, maybe you only want 5 lots, maybe you want all 35, but you submit your proposal to the developer for what they want to see on those lots, right, which is a 3-bedroom house, a certain square footage with a 1-car garage. You know, they have a list of requirements. If you get chosen, they'll give you that land for free. Okay, so this is one example of a project that they have right now. There's a development that I approved at the last meeting, two meetings ago, a development right on Sistrunk for 24 apartments and 5,000 square feet of retail space, and the CRA approved, I think it was $2.8 million for the developer, and the developer would come up with the rest, and and they were using financing to come up with the rest. So the developer was able to do that deal with very little cash out of pocket. But yeah, so there's programs that they're working right now. The CRA, the money that was allocated for the CRA to spend was allocated years ago, and by law it sunsets at a certain point in time. So CRA is going to go out of business in 3 more years. So right now we're trying to get rid of all the cash we possibly can. But it has to create jobs in the neighborhood. It has to improve the appearance of the neighborhood. It has to give value to the residents. It has to hire from the neighborhood. Right, so you have to do good with the money that you're getting. But there's a lot of money going to developers right now.
Have you ever purchased at auction, and what's that process like?
I haven't, right? So different counties do it in different ways. And in Broward County, even at the height of the downturn 10 years ago, it's not something I would have felt comfortable doing, buying properties sight unseen, because they weren't, in Broward County, they weren't as cheap at auction. That would make it worthwhile for me just to take a risk at it, right? It wasn't like you could pick up a property for $5, right? The amount that you could pick them up for was meaningful enough to me where you wouldn't want to show up at the property after getting it and realize, oh man, half of it's not there, or it's burnt out, or things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Does anybody in the class currently own any of those properties?
Yes, I do. In Fort Lauderdale.
Okay, so cool.
Victoria Park area, Rio Vista. Well, I cannot hear you now.
Questions?
For some reason, I cannot hear you now.
It got really quiet.
Better?
Yeah.
That's much better.
My son's not here to help me.
I am actually looking. We have and some lots. So family and single houses, and also some empty lots that are like our first big house. We are just on the contract now for say properties slowly next to each other in order to develop them eventually. I'm taking this class because I want to make sure some of the, like we are having plans for townhouses or stuff like this. What you are doing, we have been doing. We have bought properties, renovated it, and renting them out. And obviously over the last 10, 12 years, they have gone up in value, land value. But the question is, do you, like how fast do you develop it, expand on it?
So part of the question was breaking up quite a bit, but from what I gathered, you own a number of properties, and your question was about how fast do you expand with it, or how fast do you grow it?
Yes, I want to make sure that if, like for instance, we have one double lot in Fort Lauderdale where we have plans for 4 townhouses, and we have different construction options on it, and right now it doesn't look like it's. The question is like Professor Fogel always said, do you want to go through the brain damage of building and doing all the work, or just sell it and put the money in the bank and try to look for your next deal? So these are all options to look at. In terms of the other properties that we do property management on, I mean, they rent well, we maintain them, and yeah. sometimes we sell and sometimes not. And like now we actually first built our in Rio Vista one house out. That, yeah, looks like we're gonna make money on it, but is it? I don't know. It's a game of watching. Do you want to develop it or do you want to keep it, sell it? And this is things that I find very interesting to hear all the options. I loved when we had last time the class with the two young guys from your class, Fiscal. So I find it very interesting to listen to all the options.
Yeah, so what I'm understanding from the question is that I guess something I get asked a lot about, is current market timing, right? Is this a good time to sell something? Is this a good time to buy something? And I think that it's really, really difficult to try and time the market, right? It's very tempting because you think you want to know more than the market. The market doesn't think it's a good time to sell, but I see on the horizon that there is, or I see on the horizon that there's not. So I think that it really should be based more on, the financial metrics of what you have and what you're doing, the timing of what you want to accomplish. When I was picking up the first handful of properties, the goal was to eventually leave my day job behind. Right? So I wanted to get big enough, fast enough, where if at some point I didn't have my day job, then I could focus on properties exclusively and be able to support my family with that. Over time, the goal has changed, right? As it's gotten larger and as I no longer have a day job, right? The goal is now to just have it be large enough where I can still do those things, but it's about maximizing the amount of time I have with my young children, maximizing the travel I can do, the things I can see in the world, the experiences I can have. At a certain point of size, it becomes a lot more like a day job. And if that's not a goal of yours, then there's no reason to get any larger than you want it to be. If it provides you the type of lifestyle and quality of life that you want, then that sounds like it's the right size. Did that answer anything that you were asking at all?
You were also mentioning that you were investing in areas that are not so exclusive, and we have also properties in Overtown, and it's definitely not an easy area. And I can tell you that over the last 8 years that we've bought the properties there, the rent has almost doubled there, even though the area has developed, but it's still a rough area. It's not an easy place to be. And again, is the question that over the years we have again managed to buy properties next to each other, exponentially more expensive, like the last little corner bit, exponentially more expensive than the first one, with the idea behind to make like a big property on it with like 170 units in it. But that's a big step to swallow when you're coming from little multi-family duplexes or something to go into like a huge building.
Does Overtown have its own CRA?
Yes, they do.
Okay, so they do. So they might be able to provide some funding for this larger vision that you have.
It seems to be very lopsided though. They're happy when you do and renovate the area. They're very happy that you clean up there. That they're very happy to. But on the other hand, like we're dealing with drug dealers and stuff that the police just refuses to go by and take them out. I don't know.
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with the CRAs, I think it's important to remember that the CRA directors and the people who run the CRAs work for you. Right? So it's our tax dollars that are funding these CRAs. Some of the CRAs are better funded than other ones, so some have more money that they can spend than other ones. But if you're dealing with them on financing for your project, then they should be responding to you. They should be evaluating the stuff you submit. They should be getting back to you. They have not been, helpful in the neighborhood where I'm at, mobilizing the police. It's just not what the CRAs do. What I typically do is if I need more police presence at one of the properties, I'll go right to the commissioner for that area. Right, so the city of Fort Lauderdale has a city commission. Each commissioner has, there's one for Rio Vista in that area, there's one for different areas, and there's one for my area. And I'll email them or call them directly. If there's a situation near one of the properties or on one of the properties that I need help with, and usually they'll respond to you. If they don't, then I just keep them call, and keep calling, and eventually they'll get tired of it. And you let them know you own properties in their district and you need their help. What else?
So, Chris, one of the, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I meant to cut you off. To kind of follow up, I guess, on what Claudia is saying, just to get one more quick question in. Do you have, and I know it's kind of play by play for you, but do you kind of have a strategy in regard to your holding period? Are you trying to renovate the property, get it stabilized, and then after that 12-month period, get it reappraised and then pull some of the capital out? Or are you going for sale? If you could just kind of, I guess, put your info on that.
You know, I like the cash flow. You know, when you sell a property, you have to pay, you have to pay commissions on it, you have to pay closing costs.
It's dead. Could you put on my charger for me? It's dead.
James, your mic's on, man.
You have to pay taxes on the profits. When you refinance a deal, you don't have to do any of those things. I mean, there's still closing costs associated with the refinance. There's no commissions to the buyer's agent, to the seller's agent, etc. And you're able to use that money tax-free to invest in your next deal. So for me, I mean, everything is a long-term hold. I may sell a portion of it at some point if I can transition that portion to something larger, right? But that's more a strategic decision than, just the day-to-day stuff.
That answers it. That gives me a good idea.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Good morning. Okay, you were asking about the investment properties who has. So right before COVID, I had 3 investment properties with private lenders. They were coming up with a balloon payment for 5 years, interest only. So I had a lot of equity in them. I sold them, and now I'm kind of sitting on the equity, but I'm having fear with finding the right property to invest. My goal before, when I started to sell the properties, were to buy land and hold to eventually develop residential property, because I am also a real estate broker and I do own my own real estate company. So the goal was to sell the properties to push my company and hold some land, but now I'm at a limbo. Should I go back to fixing and flipping, or should I keep with the process of what I was doing now with looking for some land to develop my first ground up property? So my question was, do you think, is it a good time right now to try to start that for the first time, to buy land and probably build a residential home in this market we're in? Just your opinion.
So I saw some numbers, statistic on the multifamily deal flow in Dade County during the second quarter this year was the quarter of what it had been last year. So there's a real shortage of actual deals out there at market right now. So it's very difficult to find deals. And despite COVID, there are a lot of investors out there with cash on hand that are sitting in cash that are in a similar position to you. So for the deals that are out there and do become available, there's an awful lot of competition for them. So that competition is then driving down the cap rates, the returns that you can expect from these different deals. Now the plus side is that financing these deals has never been cheaper. I don't know if it's going to ever be cheaper. I think that, every time I call the bank, every couple of months when I call the bank and check up on the new pricing for deals, the interest rates keep going lower. And it's well below, I think, the point that anyone thought it would ever be at. And it should be for the at least short term, continue to be this way. I think a quote I got last week on a larger multifamily deal, and the rate was at just under 3%. And it was amortized over 25 years with 80% down. And the first 5 years of payments were going to be interest only, no principal. And that is, dirt cheap. So I think if you can find deals with a good return, or you can find deals where you can really create value, utilize that cheap financing at the same time, then I think you will set yourself up over the next 8 or 10 years to be in a really good place. On the other hand, with few deals being available, if you can build what you're looking to build affordably, I mean, there's a lot more construction people out of work these days than there were, 6 months back. There's still a lot of projects taking place and a lot of big development taking place. But 6 or 9 months ago before COVID, you couldn't find contractors to do work, large construction contractors. And now they have a little bit more room. So I think if you can build deals affordably, then it could also be a good time to build, and then you refinance that at one of these lower interest rates. Does that help?
I was, yeah, that's where I was thinking. You kind of hit everything in the nail that I was going through. So my idea for it was, instead of staying in my community, I was thinking about going to some of these outside areas like Jacksonville, where stuff is a little bit cheaper. There's not that much competition, where I could probably pull some more return or more long-term investment, where I could buy cheap and hold and put a 5-year plan. Where the market, I'm trying to study outside markets that probably would simulate what we had here 10 years ago in Broward and Palm Beach County, looking at what the economy downfall is doing in other areas and see which is going to be the next spot to invest, where you could find a duplex for $60,000 or $70,000 and renovate and sell it in 2-3 years, or because that's a lot of that's not available here in Palm Beach or Broward County or even Miami.
Right. So 5 years ago, right, 4 years ago, when things started to get tight in Broward County again, everyone was talking about going to Naples, start investing in Naples or Northern West Palm. And then, 2.5-3 years ago, everybody was talking about Orlando. And as time goes by, everybody keeps moving further and further out of field. I spoke to the guy last week that, he's working really hard to find low-cost deals in Georgia now. And this is a guy who's been a Florida investor for 25 or 30 years. So the deals in a lot of these markets may seem cheaper relative to South Florida prices. They're not the steals or the deals that they were, 4 and 5 years ago. Everybody from South Florida has moved up to, Orlando to Georgia. The gentleman last week was buying 200-unit deals in Georgia for $50,000 a unit. Right, so incredibly cheap by South Florida standards. But the rents he was getting on those, units was $525 a month in rent for a 2-bedroom. So the price is always going to have, right, a relationship to cash flow that's coming through the door. And I think the markets in, Jacksonville, Orlando up north, while they used to be a lot riper for the pickings, these days, the cash flows and the cap rates have really compressed and are very similar to what you see in South Florida. Dade County, Broward will have lower rates of return, lower cap rates. But the difference between, South Florida and North Florida has shrunk so much that unless you really know the markets, it's very difficult to go in there and say, hey, this is just going to be a home run no matter what.
So one of the things that you've done is kind of what I have tended to focus on are sort of these unique sort of niche markets, but also you have focused almost exclusively on renovating properties as opposed to new construction. Can you maybe give your perspective as to why you've chosen to focus on renovation versus new construction?
So when I was getting started, the new construction was a lot more expensive than the buy and renovate properties. And I think to this day, it still is. There's not a lot of new construction in the neighborhood that I'm in. And even today, to build these houses that I acquire would cost more than I'm able to acquire them for. If you were to build a duplex ground up, like the one I bought for $150,000, just on that, you spent $65,000 just on that piece of land in that neighborhood, let alone your construction costs, your overhead, your architect, all those pieces of it. And then, the other piece of it is as a small investor, the government, the way our tax system is set up, just offers a ton of advantages. When you're renovating properties, the money that you spend to renovate them, goes against the income that you're going to bring in. So as long as you're buying and renovating properties, you can defer the taxes on that money for a long time. As long as you keep continuing renovating, continuing spending all the cash that you bring in, So, to this day, I've had these properties for 10 years, some of them now, and still have not pulled any money out of the portfolio. All the money from the refinances, the rent, all of it, just gets put right back into the business and growing it and expanding it. As long as you keep doing that, I mean, you can just keep building that, and building that versus taking it out, paying taxes on it, and then trying to, reinvest what's left over.
So you're constantly refinancing all of your properties?
No, I mean, usually after I purchase and renovate them, after I've renovated, then I'll refinance that and take the cash out, and then I'll leave that one alone. And then, once I've bought the next property, then after I've renovated that one, then I'll refinance that one, take the cash out for the next one. So it's like a chain.
But do you have in the end one property like that is without a loan?
No, I don't think I have any properties without a loan. But I try not to over leverage, right? So I try for the portfolio as a whole, the total mortgages are only right around 52 or 53% of the value of the portfolio. So I try not to be.
Every property has like a 50% mortgage value?
So, I have one mortgage that covers 40 of the properties. And then I have a mortgage on another 6 units and a mortgage on another 2. But as a whole, the whole portfolio is only about 50% leverage or so. Yeah, I think, the benefit to that is, I use higher leverage when I'm acquiring the properties to put out as little cash as possible. But if you end up at the end of the day with a whole bunch of properties that you have very little cash in, and the market takes a turn or something unexpected like COVID happens, you're going to have a great deal of difficulty covering, your payments when tenants stop paying rent. So in the first year or two, I'm usually highly more leveraged as I'm renovating, putting all the cash into the properties. But as time goes by, I really try not to be.
So that's simply from principal accumulation, then?
It's principal pay down, and then it's market value increases.
You had mentioned that you're kind of looking to eventually get into larger multifamily deals. Do you intend on going out of state in secondary markets, or are you kind of looking for a deal if it comes in South Florida?
So I'm looking all of Florida. I would like to be in Florida because I have my real estate license in Florida. There's reciprocity with some of the neighboring states, but so I'd like to do it in Florida. I think for me, because I have a decent sized portfolio in Broward, I wouldn't mind spreading out some of that geographic risk, right? Not having it all in one county. So I think for me, having a little bit of diversity there, if hurricane hits Broward, maybe it won't hit, stuff in Orlando as much, right? So I do want to spread it around just a little bit. I have a few houses up in Orlando, but it's not a sizable portfolio, it's just a couple houses. So there's one market in Orlando that for me, replicates what I'm doing in Fort Lauderdale. So if I can find a large deal in that market in Orlando, then I pull the trigger on it tomorrow.
So, Chris, one of the things that you just briefly mentioned, that you have one loan that covers, let's say, 40-something properties, and the whole idea of kind of cross-collateralizing those assets. Could you maybe just talk about a little bit about that process of putting that type of loan together and some of the challenges and kind of circumstances surrounding that?
So around September of last year, I had loans on individual properties that were all spread out. So I think I was paying on, maybe 30 mortgages every month. And it gets really time consuming and taxing to keep track of all of it, to make sure you're getting the best rates, all the things that play into it. And on smaller deals, the banks won't give you the best interest rates. So if you just do a duplex, you're going to pay a higher interest rate than if you did an eightplex. And the 8-plex is going to be a higher interest rate than if you did, 4 units altogether. So around September of last year, at that point, I owned 40 properties, 40 units. And so I started working on a refinance of all 40 of them into a single mortgage with Pacific National Bank. And they just opened a new office in Fort Lauderdale. and they were referred to me by a graduate of the NOVA program, who's with Berkadia now, and the person at PNC actually works with also a wife of somebody at Styles who's been through the program as well. So there's about 3 or 4 different connections with PNB, right, that network. They were able to refinance 40 of the properties into a single mortgage, which I completed at the end of January. So just by moving it into a single mortgage, I was able to get a much lower interest rate, which saved me, in the neighborhood of $3,000 a month. I was able to extend the term, and I was only just able to have one single payment every single month, to make it easier to manage. So the process is tricky because they have to go and appraise the whole portfolio. You have to give a rent roll for the whole thing. They go and look at a selected, selection they pick out of the units to make sure they're all consistent. And so the process took a while, but it was really useful. And now if I want to make moves with a portion of the portfolio, then I have one lender to go through. So if I wanted to sell, 20 of the units as a package, I'm not going to 20 different lenders, I'm going to one lender. I have a specific pay down, even better terms, because the interest rate, the down payment are only one part of it. Some of the loans have prepayment penalties, some of them will allow you to sell, some won't. So there's different components of it that if you have with one lender, then it really makes it a lot easier, assuming it's a good lender. What else?
I'm assuming that also has to be beneficial for your credit and your ability to obtain financing for the smaller properties as well.
So I don't know how, because it's so that larger mortgage. So the other thing that larger mortgage did was I still had, before I went into that process, I still had about 4 or 5 properties in my personal name. So by doing that larger mortgage, I was able to move those properties out of my personal name into LLCs. So it took away some of that risk. I don't know that it helps my personal credit at all. My business has a credit score, and I assume that helps that. But I've never had a bank run my business credit score that I'm aware of and come back to me with any issues on it.
Are you able to obtain non-recourse financing, or has that been difficult for you?
So if I were to do a larger deal right now, the quotes on the larger deals are mostly non-recourse. And for anybody, right, recourse and non-recourse is the difference between you personally guaranteeing the debt and you not personally guaranteeing the debt. So for the majority of my portfolio, I do guarantee the mortgages on them personally, which is why, I try to be on the long term, that 50% leverage rate. Because I am personally guaranteed. On the larger deal, I was able to negotiate where I personally guaranteed it, but that guarantee burns off after the first couple of years. And that's typically what you can do on the larger deals as well, is that, if you don't want to personally guarantee everything, on the larger deals, usually they can be burned off after 24 months or 36 months, assuming you've made all payments on time. Because at that point, from the lender's perspective, you've also paid down some of the principal, so their exposure is less. So they may lend you at 70%, but after the first couple of years, if the market's gone up and you've paid down some of the principal, they may only be 60% exposed. So if they do need to take them back from you, they know they can sell them and get their money back.
So,
but I think with the commercial mortgages, whether it's a refinance or a large package, it's the same, right? It's still shopping around. Before I got with PNB Bank, I got rejected by 3 or 4 of the lenders who did not want to consolidate, spread out larger portfolio, and they were the lender who said yes.
So one more question about the consolidation. Is there any sort of reporting requirement that you're required to do on any regular basis about the condition of the properties or the occupancy rates or just really anything? I mean, or is it just, once again, as long as you make that monthly payment, they could care less?
So there are reporting requirements. They want to make sure the insurances are always up to date on all the properties, so you have to send them that information. They'll ask for a rent roll, an updated rent roll, maybe once or twice a year, and you just send them your current rent roll. the loan, specifies, physical condition of the different properties, but I don't believe that they have not, up to this point, sent out anybody to inspect. The main thing is getting the payments in on time, and then the reports like your rent roll and your insurances are the big ones, and then once a year, every December, they want you to complete a new personal financial statement if you personally guarantee it. And then when you file your taxes, each year we want to see a copy of your tax returns. Those are the main ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, on the rent roll, just for a lot of our students don't really even have an idea of what's contained on the rent roll. So could you kind of just walk through some of the most common elements on the rent roll?
And just to go back for a second, so one of the other benefits of having this single large lender is that, I mean, most people don't realize, but you get to negotiate with the banks the same as you negotiate with a tenant or with anybody else. So if you have a large lender and you've done a deal with them, they may charge, some closing costs on that deal. And then your second deal, it's an easy phone call. Hey, what kind of rates would I get on the second deal? What can we work on for the closing costs? Right, so it gives you a deal partner for future deals, but it also gives you a starting point for future negotiations. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
It's about rent rolls. Specifically, what kind of information would you typically put on a rent roll?
Rent roll is, just very basic. It's your property address, it's the tenant name, it's the term of their lease, January 2019 to whatever, December of 2021, etc. It's the rent they're paying, and I usually include some no provisions on mine just so I can keep track of stuff, but that's the majority of it. It's just, who's your tenants at which properties and how much are they paying, what are the dates of those. Yeah, so I just keep it on, it's just a single Excel spreadsheet and send it to them. Yeah. And it's a way to keep track of who you should be getting your rent from every month. And it winds up being the same on, small apartment buildings as it does when I was at Equity One. Every shopping center would have its own rent roll also. Commercial leases include stuff like, if it's a 5-year term, it might include the rent escalation period. So in year 2, it goes up 3%, in year 4, it goes up 5%. It might include percentage rent on there on a commercial lease. So if you have a tenant like Starbucks, typically they'll have base rent that they pay every month. But if their sales go above a certain point, right, for the year, if their sales are over $6 million, then the landlord will get a small percentage of that also. So commercial rent rolls will have percentage rent provisions. A lot of times they'll list the guarantors, right? So you might have a Subway restaurant, and the rent roll might list the guarantor of it being either a franchisee or a corporate guarantee, right, where the parent company guarantees the lease. But yeah, that's pretty uniform across all property types.
I have a question. Together with that rent roll, I guess, is that something that, well, I guess my initial question before that, I guess it ties in with the rent roll, is how do you track all your properties? And is that the same way that you just plug your rent rolls, how you just instantly have your rent rolls kind of plugged out?
It is for me. One of the things I learned at Equity One is that, you really have to be conscious of pushing the rents and just being able to track where your revenues have come from over time and your expenses. So I always carry a notebook with me that I keep notes in. In that notebook, I always have, a one-page financial printout, and that one-page financial printout is my rent roll. And then it's a couple metrics down the bottom that I measure, just seeing how my rents, my gross monthly rents this month compared to this month of last year and this month of 2 years ago, 3 years ago, so you can track how your property is coming along. But yeah, it really is.
Okay, so you don't have it's not like a software base, it's more you do things manually.
I do. I like doing manual. I use QuickBooks. QuickBooks has a good rental property platform that's like $60 a month or so, and I keep track of all my my rents and my expenses through QuickBooks. But for a big overview of the stuff I'm really keeping an eye on, it's really from the rent roll. But the QuickBooks is a good product, and you can keep track of everything. It's easy to print it off at the end of the year for the rental properties, but I don't think it's necessary when you have a few properties. I think I made it to probably 17 or 18 properties before I want to spend money on the QuickBooks. And the $60 may not seem like a lot, but when you have a lot of properties and a lot of expenses, you really try to minimize anything that you can. So for those first whole bunch of properties, I just used Excel.
I have a question. When you're doing your deals, do you put together a market feasibility study for the properties that you're going after before you walk into the bank and say, "Hey, I want a loan"?
The bank's going to run their own market data, so they won't ask you for that. And I don't know if they would take it even if you present it to them. They have their own models that they have to use and they have to complete for the people that sign off internally. When I was buying the first couple properties, I didn't know the neighborhoods as well as I know them now. I would always, gather my comps first before I bought anything. If I'm buying a 3-bedroom house, I want to know what are the rents for all the other 3-bedroom houses in the neighborhood, so that you'll know what you line up with at the end of the day. So I would do it for myself. And even these days, that's the first thing I think of if I go look at a property. I say, what do I have like this? And what are the rents I'm getting for it? So I think you always want to run that, but I don't think the banks will require it from you.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, so it used to have to have your real estate license to have access to MLS and to get access to CoStar to pull these comps. But these days, it's so much easier just because of Zillow and Trulia, and the information's not always accurate. But if you pull together enough information from these sites, you get a pretty good picture at no cost of what your comps are going to be like.
I was going to say, to piggyback off James's question, talking about the rent roll and the market analysis, you had also mentioned for one of your properties, I think that you only had one tenant in and it was like a few units. In that type of circumstance, when you're giving the bank a rent roll and there's only 25% occupancy, is there any type of special hurdles that they make you jump through kind of in order, I guess, in regards to a market analysis?
Yeah, so they would shut the door in your face if you showed them 20% occupancy at a property, and they would say, "Don't call me anymore." So for that property, that was one of the reasons why I had to get this seller financing, because the bank would not lend on only 20% occupancy, and they wouldn't lend on spec. Oh, it's only 20% now, but I know I can get it to 95% if you just bear with me. The banks won't do that unless it's maybe a ground up development deal where they want to see your projections for, as you construct the units, as you rent them out, right? They want to see the timing of your cash flows. But for stabilized deals, they'll want to see that you're fully leased up before they'll finance it. And even if they financed it and it wasn't fully leased up, you wouldn't get the best rates and you wouldn't get the best down payment.
As soon as I said it too, I thought about the seller financing. That was a really great creative financing strategy, by the way, too.
Some sellers, so these days, because the returns in the market can be so anemic, so in that scenario where if I had gotten a mortgage from a bank with that seller, and that seller collected $150,000 up front, then he'd have to take that $150,000 and find something else to invest it in, and the returns would be so low for what else he was trying to invest it in, that for him, and I found it with other sellers as well, for him to get a guaranteed 6% for a year or 2 or 3 years is not a bad way to make the money. And worst case scenario, if I don't pay, then he takes back the property he had already, keeps the money I paid him to date. So you'll find more sellers these days, and you can search, if you search on the MLS, there's specific search criteria where you can search deals that offer seller financing. And you can find out large deals too. There was an $8 million deal in southwest Orlando, or southwest of downtown, which is an area I like a lot, along Pine Hills Boulevard and so forth. And on that deal, the seller had a mortgage, this $8 million deal. The seller had an existing mortgage of $3 million that he couldn't pay off without a substantial penalty, but he could assign it. So if you were buying that property, he'd assign the $3 million mortgage to you, and then he was willing to give an additional mortgage from himself for another $3 million. And that was part of the deal. If you were going to, make an offer on that property, then he didn't want to pay off the mortgage, he wanted to assign it, and you can get the rest from him, or you can come up with the rest yourself. There are deals up there, even larger deals, with self-financing.
So that actually gets into another more, I guess, Florida-specific question that I don't really know the answer to. I haven't really looked at it that closely, but on seller financing that I've done in Texas, I've typically done more of like a contract for deed. So it's like more of like a rent-to-own sort of situation. They make lease payments to me, and then ultimately we don't deliver the deed until the final payment is made. And I'm not sure to what extent, in Florida, whether that's allowed or whether that it's more of you're still going ahead and getting a traditional mortgage. It's just that the seller just happens to be the one holding that mortgage.
Yes, that's a good question. I don't know my way all the way around the question, but from what I do know, if you're a seller, like in this case where the seller issued me the mortgage, he cannot have 2 or 3 or 4 mortgages out there with different folks, because then he's required to follow the same lender regulations as Bank of America. So if you're a seller and you're doing self-financing, I think you're limited in the number of deals you can do. But it did for this deal wind up just being like a traditional mortgage for me, just with a short term. It was the same mortgage paperwork. I owned the property from day one, just with the mortgage on it. And everything else was the same as if I got it from a typical bank.
Okay.
But it was a lot, one of the main differences was that if you do a loan with Bank of America, their loan documents may be 75 or 80 pages. And a lot of what's in there is internal Bank of America regulations, corporate policy, and things like that. The actual meat of the document is really small, and you'll see that when you do a deal with, Pacific National Bank or one of these other lenders that don't need to follow those requirements. So what I'm getting at is that the mortgage with the seller wound up being very small and very easy to go through the actual paperwork involved.
Gotcha. Because one of the reasons that we typically use the contract for deed is it doesn't require really a traditional foreclosure process. That if they stop making payments, that you can pretty much instantly, within 30, 60 days, just say, okay, you've stopped making payments, you're delinquent, boom, instantly I take in other words, there's nothing you have to really foreclose on because you've never transferred title.
Yeah, I don't believe that Florida allows that.
Yeah, many states don't.
From what I understand, Florida is one of the states that doesn't. So the issue that this lender would have had is that he would have had to go through the same, foreclosure process.
Gotcha.
Everybody else? Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions for Chris?
Questions just about property management, in general. Large property management, commercial property management, dealing with REITs, any of that?
What's the most difficult thing that you would say in regards to property management that you have to overcome? I know there's so much. If you'd have to say something specific that you don't like about it.
I think there's a lot of things that I do like about it. I think that I like dealing with the people. I like collecting the rent every month. There's a lot of facets I do like. I think that the dislike is very specific to the part of real estate that I work in these days, and it has to do with I'll have tenants that'll apply to be a tenant of the property, and they come with good background, good job, clean record, etc., and they're just the front for somebody who's going to move in the next day and start dealing drugs. So I think the issue that I deal with the most that really gets to me is dealing with drugs at the properties, and I think that can be very difficult for a lot of landlords. And I think I've developed a niche where good at it in certain ways, but I really hate it. I hate it from the perspective of the kids in the neighborhood. I hate it for what it does to my properties. I just hate that it exists and siphons resources out of neighborhoods that really need the most resources possible. Like, I really have a deep problem with it.
How do you tackle that then?
I've got a lot of stories. I think, this most recent one, I had a guy moved in. It's actually the sixth place that I purchased in March of this year. The guy moved in, and the guy was 65 years old, and he received a pension, Social Security, like a real old timer. And a clean background, I figured this is probably as safe as it gets for a tenant. He's not going to be a problem, anything. So a week after he moved in, he moved his son in with them. And some of these old timers, they've been doing it for so long and they're so good at not getting caught that he was just an experienced operator. So I'd be showing properties and I'd see people coming and going from the front door. I'd hang out there for an hour and I'd see 10 or 15 people come and go. So I find with anytime this happens, the most direct approach is the best approach. This one was kind of neat. Have you ever seen where people, wildlife observers or hunters, they'll use a game camera and they set it up at the base of a tree along a trail, and anytime a jaguar walks by, it'll snap a picture, and then it'll hold for 10 seconds, and if it sees another action, snap another picture. So I set up a game camera, camouflage game camera, and it was like $65 or such on Amazon, and I set up a game camera from right across from his front door, and just for 2 or 3 days, and I got photos of all the people that were coming and going, and I blew them up, and I printed them on like high glossy, 8.5 by 11, like the same thing that it would look like in movies if the police were surveilling you, want to present you with all the pictures. So this is like for theatrical effects. And so I had them all printed up, and then I delivered them to his front door in an envelope. And I was just straight up with him. I said, listen, we both know what's going on here. I see a lot of people coming and going. This is not going to go well for you. You're going to lose your SSI benefits if this gets reported. You need you to move on. And he agreed to do it, and he moved on. Yeah, some of them aren't always that clean.
And did you return last month's security?
I did. So I didn't return his last month's rent. I did return his deposit. The trick, and I think it comes down to knowing your tenants. So for this guy, he wasn't going to find another. With him receiving Social Security, he only receives a certain amount of income every month, regardless of the income he's receiving from his other activities. And so for him to move out cleanly and get another place, he needed a deposit back bill. If I had to pay to go through the eviction process, it would take $700. And these days with COVID, maybe 6 or 7 weeks, uncontested. If you contested, it would take longer. So yeah, I gave him back some money to move on easily, and he left the place in good shape. So it ended up being fine, handled like businessmen, which probably explains why he doesn't have any of this stuff. I had another tenant at another property that I had evicted earlier during COVID, and as you remember, there was eviction moratoriums in place, and there was still a residential moratorium in place, a federal one, until January 1st, at least. And so for a while, Broward County wasn't doing any evictions, but what you could file for is you could file for an unlawful detainer, which is a different filing than evictions. They weren't doing evictions, they were doing unlawful detainers. So if you filed for an unlawful detainer, you could get it done in 4 to 5 weeks. The cost was about $850 instead of $750, with my attorney doing it. And the unlawful detainer is just somebody's in possession of the property that doesn't have a lease, and the police can't evict the person that way. So there's different ways depending on the tenant. You may have, in that case, that the tenant would not respond to me, and they'd always have 4 or 5 people at the door. They're running drugs out of the place, and running women out of the place. So it was just a bad scenario. And
how do you say that they don't have a lease when, I assume they moved in with a lease?
So this was a property, this was a tenant who was at the property when I acquired the property. So they didn't have a lease. And even if the person who was there was on the lease, the people who were selling the drugs weren't on the lease. So it might be harder to do that if you had a tenant who's been in place for 3 years and then decides that you need to get them out. But in that specific instance, that worked for me. But for every scenario you deal with, it's gonna be a little bit different. But that one I had to do actually go through the course because he was not responding. And that was like a place where, I'm knocking on a lot of doors, but that was one where it was like, I knocked the first time and it was, you could tell it was a bad environment. I don't want to put myself somewhere where, things can happen.
Do you do like month to month as in your leasing strategy, or are you going for long-term leases?
So a lot of landlords these days, and I talked with the bank about it. So the banker told me that these days, because the banks always want to see a rent roll and they want to see at least a year of lease, right? They want to see 1 year leases. They don't want to see month to month and 6 month leases. But the banker told me that a lot of landlords, just out of prudence these days, are only doing month to month leases for folks, and the banks don't have a problem with it anymore. The banks are happy that you're still paying the mortgage, and if you have to do month to month with somebody to be able to do it, then they're fine with that. I still do year-long leases. I think that hopefully this will pass, and I don't want to be in a position at the end of COVID where all my tenants give me a 30-day notice and then move out. So I'm still doing 1 year leases. If I have a slow-paying tenant whose lease is coming up, I'll keep a month to month for 3 or 4 months. Just to not take the risk these days of having to evict. And on the new leases, I used to just take a month of security. Now I'm getting first, last, and security. So that's the way that I'm dealing with leases in the time of COVID. But I was surprised that the banks don't have a problem with it anymore. I mean, it makes sense, but I think a lot of landlords are just letting everybody go month to month because you can't evict them otherwise. So if you're month to month, then you give them 30 days. So unfortunately, the eviction moratorium, which was designed to help people, winds up hurting people because now you get all those tenants who are only on month to month and have no protections. Right? So sometimes unforeseen things happen when you make, market decisions like that. But so you've got a lot of tenants out there who are month to month and are poachable or can move on to the next property quickly and let them die and dry.
So I don't think you specifically mentioned this. If you did, how many tenants, if any, did you have that did have problems related to COVID in terms of paying?
I thought it'd be a lot worse. When it initially happened, there were a lot of layoffs, and I dealt with some difficult months because of the layoffs. But I think as a whole, right now I'm 100% occupied, 100% paying. A couple tenants are paying slow and are being patient and are charging late fees. But after that initial rush, the first 60, 90 days, things get back to normal pretty quickly. I do see more turnover these days where tenants, it's the end of the lease, they've been struggling, and so they need to leave and move in with other family. Right? So I do see more turnover. But as far as folks not paying, unfortunately, I was evicting 2 tenants right before COVID hit. And I got the judgments like the week before COVID hit, but I couldn't get them out after COVID hit. So I had 2 tenants who weren't paying before COVID that I got the eviction orders for that stayed in place until like July when their leases expired. So I had folks who owed me money going into COVID and then saw no reason to pay while we were in COVID. So that was, I think, the worst period of time. But on the whole, I haven't had any folks, and I've had folks come to me say, hey, this month is going to be difficult, so we've come up with creative solutions. So if a tenant has a good size security and they've been a great tenant for a long time and just having a rough month, I'll let them take half that security and apply it to maybe half a month's rent or such, just to help them get through the tough times. I'll work out payment plans with folks so that they don't get late fees. For good tenants, I'll work with them during COVID, same as I would before COVID if they lost their job. But I haven't seen a whole lot of fallout from it. I know that some landlords have. I think that if you create a great product, I've said before, I think I have the nicest interiors in the worst neighborhoods. So I think if you have a product that's in demand, then the tenants will want to stay there. And if you always treat them fairly, then they'll stay with you. I think you got to know them, you got to know their circumstances. I had a husband and wife who both worked at a car dealership. Our dealership was closed for those first couple of months. They both were out of work. So I worked with them on their payments. I let them apply some of the security. They get hired back, they continue paying, right back to normal. So it really just depends. I've seen other landlords who are down occupancy-wise to 75 to 80%. I think inferior product in the market is probably lower than that. I think if tenants need an excuse not to pay, this gives them a perfect excuse not to pay even if they still can. But if you know your tenants and you have legitimate, issues, then I always do try to work with them.
Worked with all the tenants. I worked with all of them and did not apply any late fees. And I literally had, like when you know your tenants, when they're in for it, they know they don't want to let you down either. And they don't, some called me and said, listen, I lost my job. I would love to keep the house, but I cannot keep it. And they said, and I don't want to lose you as a tenant. Let's work with it. And by now, actually, everybody has paid back the amount that they were missing. Like some were paying in 2 months, like half months, and then at the end of slower rates. But some I lowered the rent, but they paid it afterwards. They paid it as soon as they got the jobs back. They paid it over the next few months, and they are up to date again. And some had to move their jobs, and they had to let them out of the lease, and they would look for tenants to replace them. I have that situation also, because they move into another state. I'm not holding them up to the lease then. I do release them.
And as well, if you're a tenant who can't pay during COVID and they want to get out and they're current with you, I'm happy to let them out of the lease. One of the strange things about COVID is that despite the issues for in-place tenants, the leasing activity has been as strong as ever. And I don't know if Claudia, you've seen that also, but when I have a place that's vacant, despite COVID, it gets filled within 4 or 5 days. And I've seen rent increases continue like they were before COVID. I had a house 2 weeks ago that the tenant was paying $1,300 a month. He moved out at the end of his lease. The tenant rented within 3 days at like $1,500 a month.
Wow.
So from that perspective, and I think the tenants know that. I think the tenants know that yes, they can leave, but they still have to go somewhere else. And that other place may be more expensive, and there's going to be a lot of competition for it. So despite maybe lower occupancy numbers, the rental rates and rental actions going just as fast as it was before.
No vacancy. In 30 units in Fort Lauderdale, and I had some vacancy in Overtown. In Overtown, I had a good 10% vacancy.
Okay. Well.
If nobody has any more questions now, I'm happy to stay around for as long as you guys want to have me. You can always feel free to send me an email, send me a text, whatever's easy. I can send around my email and phone numbers. And once COVID's over, I have an office right by downtown Fort Lauderdale. If you want to stop by, grab a coffee or scotch, and catch up on real estate or any projects you're working on or anything else, I'm very happy to help. And if you need to
where is your email and telephone number?
I was going to ask you to drop your details, Chris, on maybe the chat or something.
I can email it around to everybody. It should be on the last slide, but I don't know if the last slide's probably not showing anymore.
Yeah, Chris, if you want to put your slide back up, that's fine. I just took it down so everybody could see everybody. So if you wanted to share your screen again, if you've got it right there.
He needs his son.
Can you see it now?
There you go. Perfect.
Always happy to talk. Other students from other classes have come through my office and called me for different deals they're working on. And like I said, I work every day with folks who've also come through the program and may not be involved with it today. But if you need to talk to a broker about something, my broker came through the program and I share an office with him. A couple buddies of Styles have been through the program, so if you need contact over there, whatever else I can do to help, I'm happy to do it.
Okay. All right, Chris, thanks again for taking the time to do this for us. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure there'll be some of the folks will be in contact with you. So.
Thank you so much, Mr. Murphy.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. Let's see here. Okay, I think we're all back here. Okay, why don't we do this? It, I guess, is what, 10 o'clock your time, so let's take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll get started with the remainder of the stuff for the day. Okay?